Welcome back. We're now looking at our final lesson on Chapter 7, Energy Changes. And the final lesson, if you can find it, is hydrogen fuel cells. And what we're going to look at today, we're going to evaluate the use of hydrogen fuel cells. Okay? This last couple of lessons have been about cells and batteries. Just want to recap. Okay? What happens in a chemical cell? What happens inside a battery? What's the useful thing that occurs? Hopefully you recall, chemicals react to produce electricity. So in a chemical cell, we've shown that chemicals can react to produce electricity. I'm going to change tracks just for a moment. When we think of a fuel normally, fuel in a car, we think of petrol or diesel. And the petrol or diesel, it burns in the engine. It burns. It doesn't release electricity. It burns and it releases heat energy, which is used in the motor to power the vehicle. So at the moment, most of our vehicles are used by burning a fuel. Okay? And the fuel that they burn, petrol or diesel, we often refer to them as hydrocarbons. Now, hydrocarbons we'll do more about later in the year. Hydrocarbons are compounds that contain hydrogen and carbon only. And petrol and diesel are hydrocarbons. And in the car, they are burned. Okay? Why are scientists concerned about the use of hydrocarbons as fuels? What is the problem when we burn a hydrocarbon? Well, when they burn, they release carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. I'm sure we know carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, causes global warming. You'll already know lots of the consequences of global warming. We'll talk more about that later. But I just wanted to get an idea that at the moment, most of our vehicles burn a fuel, and they burn hydrocarbons, and they cause global warming. Now, hydrogen is being developed as a fuel. Okay? If hydrogen is going to be a fuel in the standard way, what properties does it need to have? Well, it's very flammable, so that will make it a good fuel. But also, if you think about what will be made when hydrogen burns. If hydrogen burns, it reacts with oxygen. Okay, obviously it doesn't contain any carbon. There's no carbon in the fuel. So what will be the only thing made when hydrogen burns as a fuel? It only makes water. If we burn hydrogen, it only makes water when it's burned. Therefore, it doesn't make any carbon dioxide. If we can use hydrogen as a fuel rather than a hydrocarbon, we're not going to make any carbon dioxide. So hydrogen is going to be an important fuel in the future. Maybe we'll see more buses like this in the future. We're saying that the waste product from the bus is water, and water is not a pollutant. Now, ignore the writing at the top for a moment. So, when we think about hydrogen as a fuel, then we think of it maybe burning, but that's not what's going to happen in the future. We're going to use hydrogen in a fuel cell. We're going to get the hydrogen to react with oxygen, but it's not going to generate heat because it's going to react in a cell. So rather than generating heat, we're going to get the hydrogen and the oxygen to react. They'll still make water, but rather than making heat, it's going to make electricity. So hydrogen fuel cells have been developed for cars. Rather than burning the hydrogen reacts with oxygen to produce electricity. And this is the fundamental principle of a hydrogen fuel cell. You can look at the picture. We're going to have a supply of hydrogen. We're going to have a supply of oxygen. And they are going to react, and they are going to produce electricity. Okay? So the overall reaction in a hydrogen fuel cell involves the oxidation of hydrogen, so the hydrogen reacting with oxygen to produce water. The only waste product will be water, but it will make electricity, which is going to power the vehicle. Right. Now here's a simplified picture of a hydrogen fuel cell, we've got hydrogen coming in at the negative electrode, and the hydrogen is going to release electrons. We've got oxygen at the positive electrode, and the oxygen is going to gain electrons. Now the hydrogen and oxygen are going to react in the cell, but they need an electrolyte. They're going to react in an electrolyte, and the electrolyte is going to be an alkali. It's a very complicated picture, this. I'm going to talk through it because you're going to have to know some of the details of this cell. So, turn over. Reactions in the hydrogen fuel cell. So the electrolyte that's going to be inside the cell, if it's an alkali, what will it contain? Well, it contains hydroxide ions, or OH minus ions. Then we're going to have hydrogen gas. Do you remember which electrode is hydrogen gas supplied to? It goes to the negative electrode. Now, it doesn't react at this point with the oxygen. The hydrogen gas reacts with the hydroxide ions that are in the electrolyte. And it's then going to form water. And the hydrogen is going to lose electrons, and hopefully you remember, if it's losing electrons, it means it's being oxidised. And we can represent this in an equation. And it will be a good idea, if possible, if you can learn this equation. We're going to have hydrogen reacting with the hydroxide ions. It's going to make water, and it's going to then release electrons. So this is one of the half equations that happens in the hydrogen fuel cell. You should try and learn this equation. Hydrogen reacting with the hydroxide ions to make water and release electrons. Now, at the same time then, oxygen gas is going to be supplied to the positive electrode. Now, it's going to form or reform more hydroxide ions. And again, there's going to be a half equation. And the oxygen is going to gain electrons. What's that process known as when something gains electrons? That's right, that's reduction. So, now oxygen is going to react with water. It is going to gain electrons and is going to reform hydroxide ions. So, there's two reactions that are happening. One with the hydrogen reacting with the hydroxide ions to form water. One with the oxygen and the water to form hydroxide ions. And again, this is the other equation that we're going to try and learn. Overall though, if one reaction is making hydroxide ions, one of the reactions is using hydroxide ions, overall, we can simply say that the hydrogen is reacting with the oxygen to make water. And we've cancelled out the hydroxide ions. So overall, in a hydrogen fuel cell, hydrogen reacts with oxygen to make water, and this generates electricity. This is a very complex, complicated idea, but I want you to try and learn those two half equations and think about the overall equation that's happening in a hydrogen fuel cell. Hydrogen reacts with oxygen to make water, and it generates electricity. So, why would we want to use a hydrogen fuel cell? Well, think about that equation there. If that's the reaction that's happening, what is the only product? What is the only thing that's made in this reaction? That's right, it's water. Why is it an advantage that only water is made? Well, only water is produced, so no carbon dioxide is given off. If no carbon dioxide is given off, it's not going to contribute to global warming. And also, the hydrogen fuel cell will not need recharging like a normal battery. So this is not, it's not a battery that gets plugged in overnight. A hydrogen fuel cell will keep on running as long as there is a supply of hydrogen. So the battery doesn't need recharging, but it will need topping up with hydrogen, like a normal petrol car would need topping up with petrol. A hydrogen fuel car would need topping up with hydrogen. Now, there are disadvantages of hydrogen fuel cells. Like we said, first of all, if hydrogen is very flammable, what could be a disadvantage of using it? Well, hydrogen is explosive, so it is potentially dangerous. Also, if it's an explosive gas, what costs might be involved of when you have to use an explosive gas? Well, it's very difficult to store. Hydrogen is difficult to store, so it is expensive. And finally, we've talked about the advantages of hydrogen being that it doesn't contribute to global warming, but where do we get the hydrogen from in the first place? Well, hydrogen often comes from crude oil, and crude oil is non-renewable. So using crude oil to make the hydrogen is a non-renewable process. Okay? So, just to recap, this lesson was about hydrogen fuel cells, and it's a chemical reaction that happens in a cell where hydrogen and oxygen react to produce water, and it generates electricity. That's the fundamentals of it. If you can, it'd be good if you could learn the two half equations to show how the hydrogen and the oxygen are actually reacting and losing and gaining electrons. And I want you to try and learn the advantages and disadvantages of the hydrogen fuel cells. Any questions on this, you can speak to your teacher. Hopefully you've got some questions that's called cells and batteries homework. I suggest you have a look at those. Hopefully that makes sense. And I will